I will never forget the sound of that voice on the phone. He was my son, but he didn't look like my son. Mom, I need you to tell me the truth now. His silence pierced my chest like a knife. I knew Melissa had found out. I knew her mask had slipped, but I had no idea what would come next. Because that morning, my son didn't just want answers. He wanted to know who I really was, and the truth he was about to hear, it would destroy everything Melissa built with lies and change the destiny of our family forever. I still remember the smell of the fluffy rice I was stirring in the pot when I heard Melissa's voice cutting through the air like a knife. You don't even work, do you? It must be hard depending on others for everything. She said this laughing, very loudly, as if she were making a joke for an audience. And the whole family, my own relatives, stood there between uncomfortable giggles and averted glances. In that instant, I felt time stop for a second, not because of the insult itself, but because of the courage, the audacity of a girl who barely knew me speaking to me like that. My first impulse was to answer, "Oh, my dear, if it were a few years ago, perhaps I would have returned the compliment in the same tone." But I took a deep breath. I gripped the wooden spoon tightly, felt the warmth of the steam on my face, and swallowed it like one swallows a bitter truth. Because I knew, deep down, I knew something Melissa could never imagine. So I just looked at her and smiled in that calm way that makes arrogant people uncomfortable. And I asked in the softest voice in the world, "Would you like to help here, my dear?" She rolled her eyes, as she always did when she wanted to show superiority. "Never mind, mother-in-law.
Cooking isn't my forte.
I have more important things to do at my company." And it was that my company that almost made me laugh. I didn't laugh, of course, but inside, inside I laughed like I hadn't in years. Because if there's one thing life has taught me, it's that some insults are only worthwhile when you return them at the right moment, and with the whole truth. My son, standing beside her, didn't open his mouth. Not even a "Mom, don't talk like that." Not even a sigh. He remained quiet, staring at the floor like a boy who had just broken a vase and didn't know whether to run or fight. And that hurt more than any words. You raise children to have backbone, you know? To know how to distinguish right from wrong. But at that moment, he seemed to shrink behind the superficial glow of the woman he claimed to love. While stirring the pot, I remembered when I used to work double shifts, arriving late, going to bed early, and waking up before sunrise. I remembered when I founded my own company alone, with no one to catch me when I stumbled. I remembered every night I spent studying contracts, learning numbers, attending meetings, overcoming my exhaustion. I remembered my struggle, and incredibly, Melissa never wanted to know any of that, because, to her, I was just an unemployed old woman.
Poor thing.
She continued talking, as she always did, talking too much when she wanted to impress. At the company, people who don't perform are discarded. That's how it works in the real world. She said this while drinking wine, with her nose in the air. I watched her in silence. I observed each word leaving her mouth as if they were small arrows shot into the air. Little did she know that she worked precisely at the company of the old, unemployed woman she so despised. When Melissa finished the sentence, she looked at me, expecting some reaction. Maybe tears, maybe a returned insult, maybe humiliation. But I just put the lid on the pot and said, "The world turns, my dear." "Oh, how it does." She gave a mocking little laugh, saying, "Those are the kinds of phrases retired people use." And at that moment I realized what she really was, someone who confuses youth with power and ignorance with courage. Still, I didn't answer. Not at that moment, because I felt, deep down, that the universe was preparing a bigger scene. Something she would never forget. And neither would I. So I held my tongue and let her drown in her own arrogance. Little did Melissa know that that dinner, that insult, would only be the first domino to topple everything she thought she controlled. From the moment we sat down at the table, I could already tell Melissa was different. She seemed puffed up, you know? Like someone who wakes up thinking the whole world revolves around her. Every gesture she made was exaggerated, studied, almost theatrical. It was as if she had decided to transform that simple family dinner into her own private stage. And there, sitting at the head of the table, I felt like I would be the favorite part of this performance, even though I hadn't asked to be a part of any of it. She started with seemingly harmless comments, the kind where only a paying attention notices the underlying intention. Wow, mother-in-law, you still use such old dishes? This must be from the last century. And she gave a forced little laugh, looking at the others as if expecting approval. Some smiled politely, others lowered their gaze. But I felt, firsthand, that it wasn't about the dishes.
It was about me.
About the image she wanted to create of an outdated, old-fashioned mother-in-law, out of touch with her modern world. With each bite, she made a point of correcting something. This meat could be more tender. This seasoning is too strong. I would have used less salt, but everyone cooks in their own way. All said in that sweet, venomous voice, you know? The voice that hurts slowly. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my heart calm, because I knew that reacting there would be giving her exactly the show she wanted. And I, after so many years, have learned that silence also has power. At one point, she snapped her fingers, calling my son over as if he were a waiter. Honey, can you get us some more water? Your mother forgot to put the pitcher nearby. I felt a pang in my chest, not because of the water, but because of the way she belittled my son, and me along with him. And he, my son, stood up without hesitation, obeying as if he were already used to hearing orders. That hurt me more than any of her bitter words. When she started talking about the prestigious company where she worked, Melissa settled into her chair like a queen. She spoke of positions, projects, and important decisions that ordinary people wouldn't understand. And, without looking directly at me, she blurted out, "In my job, everyone needs to prove their worth. We can't keep people who do nothing, can we?" I could have said so much, but I kept quiet. Not out of fear, but because certain truths need to be kept until the right time. It was when she started comparing her own life to mine that I felt something inside me shift. I wouldn't have the patience to live such a stagnant life, mother-in-law. It must be awful to grow old without something to be proud of. Her words pierced me like thin knives, not because of the cruelty itself, but because of the profound ignorance. Those who live for appearances never imagine the weight of the silence of someone who has already achieved what she doesn't even know how to name. Every now and then, I glanced at those around me. Some seemed uncomfortable, others confused, but no one said anything. No one ever does, right? Because confronting arrogant people takes courage, and courage is a rare commodity these days. I continued stirring my food slowly, listening to each veiled attack, like someone watching a storm brewing on the horizon. Because I knew this was nothing yet. It was just the wind. And in the midst of all that theatrics, while she talked and talked without stopping, I felt something inside me heat up. It wasn't anger, it was certainty. Certainty that the world has a curious way of placing each person exactly where they deserve to be. And there, at that table lit by candles and filled with the scent of arrogance, I understood that Melissa was digging her own grave inch by inch, word by word. And little did she know the size of the fall she was preparing for herself. From the moment Melissa started needling me, my gaze instinctively drifted to my son. I watched him like a mother watches her son when he's about to touch a hot stove, waiting, hoping, silently pleading for some reaction to prevent disaster. But he remained there, motionless, quiet, his hands clasped as if trapped in a place he didn't know he belonged. My heart ached because I know that boy, and that silence wasn't his. My son's silence has always had meaning. When he was little, he would be quiet before crying. In adolescence, he would fall silent when he was afraid of disappointing someone. As an adult, that quietness only appeared when he carried guilt or doubt. And there, at that dinner, I saw exactly that same old silence. The silence of someone who knows what is right but no longer knows if they can choose. It was like watching my son lose himself before my eyes, and me being powerless to do anything. Whenever Melissa threw a provocative joke, I could see in his eyes that he felt the blow. He blinked faster, took deep breaths, fidgeted with his fingers as if trying to contain an impulse. But nothing came out of his mouth. No words, no defense, no line of protection between me and that poison disguised as a joke. I felt as if I were facing two versions of my son, the one I created and the one Melissa molded. I remembered when he defended his classmates at school, even when it meant punishment. I remembered when he stood up to an unfair boss to protect a friend. I remembered the courage he carried on his shoulders, the firmness in his chest, the clear understanding of what was right. And there he was, silent, small, faded, as if someone had extinguished the light I once saw being born. The truth is, I had already noticed Melissa's influence before that dinner. Her comments, the way she controlled schedules, opinions, even the clothes my son wore. But that night was different. It was as if the pieces fell into place before me, all at once. His silence wasn't respect or tact. It was fear. Fear of contradicting the woman who turned small situations into major emotional battles. If there's one thing that breaks a mother's heart, it's seeing her child shrink into himself. And when Melissa spoke louder, I saw him shudder a little, trying to appear natural. I saw her squeeze his knee under the table. It wasn't affection. It was a warning that said, "Be quiet." And he was. Oh my God, how that hurt. Not him.
Me.
I wanted to hug him right there in the middle of everyone and say, "My son, you don't have to live like this." But I knew that saying something at that moment would only give Melissa more ammunition. So I took a deep breath, swallowed the pain, and observed. I observed every gesture, every look, every micro-expression of the woman who claimed to be part of my family, and every micro-defeat etched on my boy's face. And as dinner continued, something within me stirred. A mixture of deep sadness and an old indignation, one I didn't even know still resided within me. I realized that if I didn't open his eyes, no one else would. And in that instant, looking at the crushed silence of my own son, I understood that this story was far from over. But I also realized that when the truth finally came to light, much would change forever. While Melissa continued to talk as if she understood everything about life, I found myself looking at my own hands. Hands that were once so strong, so quick, so full of calluses and battle scars. Today they tremble a little when I'm tired, but they still hold stories that no arrogant girl could ever imagine. And while she belittled me without even knowing my story, I realized something simple. Melissa never asked anything about me, because she never wanted to know. I built my life on hard work. There was no inheritance, no shortcuts, no one opening doors for me. I remember working all day and still studying at night, with weak coffee on the table and a notebook full of dreams in front of me. I remember waking up before sunrise, getting my son ready for school, and still leaving with a smile, because I knew that every sacrifice was building something bigger in the future. I also remember when I started my first business. It was in a small, hot, rented room, smelling of fresh paint with a wobbly table. I worked alone for months, serving customers, answering emails, managing inventory, signing contracts, dealing with problems that many people wouldn't even know where to begin. And little by little, what was just an idea became a company. A real company. A solid company. A company that put food on my table and pride in my heart. But Melissa? Melissa. To her, I was just an ordinary, outdated lady who had lost her social usefulness. She never realized that if she could parade around with her airs of grandeur today, it was because someone, me, had created the ground she was standing on. And the most curious thing is that she talked so much about meritocracy, effort, and ability, but she never even imagined that someone like me could have lived through all of that. Many times, I wanted to tell my story. I wanted to share my victories, show my triumphs, and discuss the battles I've won. But Melissa never gave me the space. Every time I started to say something, she would change the subject, or pretend not to hear. Or she would say, "Oh, mother-in-law, those old stories," as if the past didn't build the present, as if experience were disposable, as if wisdom were trash. I learned that some people prefer to believe in stereotypes rather than reality. And Melissa felt comfortable seeing me as a simple woman, without ambition, without a career, without a voice, because that made her feel superior. And insecure people do that. They need to diminish others to believe they shine. She never knew that if I wanted to, I could dismantle that image in seconds. But I chose silence. I chose to observe. I chose to wait. While she talked about important projects, I thought about my first meetings with investors, the hours I spent pulling all-nighters adjusting strategies, the feeling of victory when I signed my first big contract. She would never imagine that the woman stirring pots in the kitchen was the same one who had once commanded rooms full of men who underestimated me and who ended up respecting me. And there, sitting at that table, watching Melissa boast about a world she barely knew, I understood a delicious irony. She was always talking about power, but she had no idea what it was really like to have it. And little did she know that, very soon, she would discover, in the most bitter way possible, who the woman she called old, unemployed woman really was. Melissa always talked about her job as if it were a gold medal hanging around her neck. It was impressive to see the gleam in her eyes when she mentioned this renowned company, as if it automatically placed her a level above everyone at the table, especially above me. She described meetings with complicated terms, used English expressions out of context, and spoke as if she were indispensable to the functioning of the place. I listened to her in silence because I knew a truth she would never have dreamed of. Sometimes she exaggerated the details so much that I felt like she forgot who she really was. She would say things like, "I make important decisions every day," or "My department doesn't function without me," as if she were the central cog in a gigantic machine. But anyone who knows arrogant people knows, the greater the insecurity, the greater the act. It was clear to me that Melissa was using the job to fill some void she was avoiding looking at. I watched my son, sitting beside her, listening to everything with an admiring expression. And it hurt, because it was clear he truly believed every word she said. He thought he had married a powerful, successful, independent woman. And, in a way, I didn't want to shatter that illusion, not there, in front of her. I let the enchantment continue, because my son needed to see for himself what she really was. Deep down, I knew Melissa clung to that professional image because it was the only asset she had. She wasn't kind, she wasn't empathetic, she wasn't respectful. What she had was her position. And so, she used it as a weapon, as a shield, as a way of saying, "I'm worth more than you." It was a kind of smokescreen. If she spoke loudly enough about her own success, no one would look at the emptiness behind the curtain. When she started talking about people who aren't performing and need to be replaced, I almost bit my tongue to keep from laughing. Because the company where she worked was precisely the environment where this type of behavior was recorded, and very well documented. She talked so much about competence, but seemed oblivious to the fact that half of the formal complaints I received came from her department. Melissa saw herself as a star, but in reality, she was more of a problem than a solution. I always heard colleagues, employees, and even managers comment cautiously, "She's talented, but difficult." And difficult was a kind word. Melissa treated subordinates as if they were inferiors, left tasks incomplete, blamed others for her own mistakes, and created unnecessary conflicts. But the most striking thing was that she truly believed no one saw it. That her image as a great professional was irrefutable. People like that forget that the truth always comes out. And sitting at that table, listening to her boast about her own importance, I could only think about the moment she would find out. The moment her world, built on layers of ego, would begin to crumble. Because real trust isn't built with pretty words. It's built with good character. And that she never had. Melissa thought she ran the office, but she was about to discover true power. As she spoke, gesturing as if she owned the place, I felt a pang of anticipation. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't a desire to see someone fall. It was the certainty that life, sooner or later, reaps what we sow, and Melissa had been sowing arrogance for a long time. I knew her harvest was coming. And when it did, oh, my dear, she would remember every word she said at that dinner. While Melissa boasted about her high position, I almost felt like pushing my chair back and laughing. Not a mocking laugh, but that silent laugh you let out when you know a truth so big that the whole world seems small next to it. Because there, in front of that impromptu audience, she was talking about the company, as if she owned it, as if it were indispensable, and she didn't even suspect that the real owner was sitting right in front of her, stirring her food with the utmost tranquility. I started that company with my own hands. I built wall by wall, created each department, developed each training program. And when the business grew enough, I hired directors, delegated, let the machine run on its own because I needed time to live,
To breathe.
to be a mother and, later, a grandmother. And it was during this period, when I was no longer in the building every day, that Melissa came in. She came in knowing nothing about me. She came in thinking it was just another job. She came in thinking she could be whoever she wanted. The most curious thing is that, even without knowing who I was, she had already caught my attention long before she started dating my son. Employees in her department commented on her explosive temper, her emotional instability, and the veiled threats she made when someone disagreed with her. I was always discreet about my position. I never needed to flaunt my power. And perhaps that's why Melissa never imagined that all the reports, complaints, and warnings involving her name passed through my desk first. I remember exactly the day I first saw her name in an internal report. I read that document twice, then 3 times. And I thought, this girl needs boundaries. But I never imagined she would end up in my family. Life has these ironies that you don't understand at first. And when my son showed up with her, all smitten, saying he had met a hard-working and dedicated woman, I took a deep breath and decided to observe. Little by little, I started putting the pieces together. The way she talked about her colleagues, her habit of placing herself above everyone else, her constant need for validation. And the arrogance. That was unmistakable. Always greater than common sense. Always greater than character. When she started treating me like someone irrelevant, as if I were just any old lady with no history, no past, no weight in the world, I realized that the truth would one day be her own punishment. And at that table, while she was discoursing on efficiency, productivity, and competence, I felt a chill in my stomach. Because it was impossible not to imagine the scene that was to come. The moment when she would sit before HR with the same air of superiority and receive the envelope that would change everything. An envelope with my signature. The signature she didn't even recognize, but which would decide her future. I glanced at Melissa between bites. She talked, gestured, seemed self-important, and all I could think was, if you only knew. I could almost feel my own breath catch in my throat under the weight of that secret. It was a truth too big to contain within me. A truth that would change everything. Her job, her self-image, and even how my son saw her. But I didn't say anything.
Not there.
Not at that dinner full of arrogance and superficiality. Because the truth, that specific truth, needed a stage. It needed the right time. It needed silence beforehand and impact afterward. And at that moment, while Melissa smiled, thinking she ruled the world, I just thought, tomorrow, my daughter, tomorrow you will discover who the old, unemployed woman you so enjoy humiliating really is. When dinner was finally over, I slowly rose from the table, as if carrying an old weight on my back. Melissa left laughing, my son clearing the dishes, and I went to my room with short steps, feeling each heartbeat as a warning. I closed the door behind me, sat on the edge of the bed, and took a deep breath. The silence in the house seemed greater than usual, almost sacred. It was as if the entire universe was waiting, silently, for the decision I would finally make. I picked up my phone, my hands still warm from the kitchen heat. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, thinking about everything I had swallowed for months. Every veiled humiliation, every comment, every situation Melissa created to try and belittle me. And, behind it all, the disrespect towards my son, the emotional control, the silent manipulation. It was as if she had planted tiny cracks in that family, and I knew that if I did nothing, those cracks would turn to ruins. I called HR directly. Not just any receptionist, but someone who had grown up with me in that company. Someone who knew who I was, what I had built, and the weight my voice carried. When he answered, all I had to do was say, "We need to talk about Melissa," and I heard a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. A sigh that said far more than words could. He began to carefully list all the accumulated reports. Complaints about abusive behavior. Notes about disorganization. Lack of respect for colleagues. aggression disguised as demands, inappropriate comments, and, to my sadness, but not surprise, even a record of a female employee crying after an argument with her. I listened to everything in silence, with a heavy heart, not for Melissa, but for those she hurt. When he finished, there was a pause. A long, heavy, almost painful pause. That's when he asked, "Do you want to proceed with the resignation?" And I closed my eyes. I saw my mother's face, who always told me that dignity is priceless. I saw my son's face, who no longer smiled as before. I saw my own reflection, tired but firm, and I said, in the calmest voice in the world, "Yes, tomorrow." His voice changed. It became more serious, more careful. "She doesn't know who you are, does she?" I smiled to myself. A sad but necessary smile.
No.
And that's exactly why it needs to be now. Because Melissa needed to learn that the world doesn't revolve around the image she builds. The world responds to character. It always has. It always will. I hung up the phone and sat there, still holding the device in my hand. The silence of the room seemed to breathe with me. It wasn't a feeling of victory, nor of revenge. It was duty. It was justice. It was the certainty that if I didn't do it, more people would suffer from her temper, including my son. I couldn't allow her arrogance to continue growing unchecked. When I finally stood up, my legs felt lighter. There was a calmness inside me, the dangerous calmness of someone who knows exactly what will happen the next day. And, at that moment, as I walked down the dark hallway toward the living room, I had a silent certainty. Tomorrow would be a turning point. For her, for my son, and for me. The next morning, I woke up even before the alarm clock rang. My body knew that this would be a memorable day, one of those days you keep in your memory as an important chapter of your life. While I was making my coffee, I could imagine exactly the scene that would be happening on the other side of town. Melissa entering the company with that hurried gait, stomping her feet, carrying her arrogance as if it were a designer handbag slung over her shoulder. She always arrived early, not out of dedication, but to be seen. She liked to make noise, to assert herself, to give the impression that the entire office depended on her presence. She would enter greeting some with a forced smile, ignoring others, giving orders even before putting her bag in the drawer. In her mind, that place was her own private kingdom where she could exercise power without being questioned. Little did she know that the rug was about to be pulled out from under her feet. While I was drinking my coffee, I could almost hear her telling the story of the dinner to her colleagues. I imagined every word. "Guys, you have no idea what my mother-in-law is like. She's so clueless, so useless, poor thing." And of course, some joke about me not working. That was how Melissa operated. She belittled others to seem bigger. It was her fuel. And that fuel was about to run out. In the office, she probably strutted around in her high heels, tapping them loudly on the floor, as if she wanted to be announced with every step. She must have entered the department with a confident smile, handed out orders, corrected other people's work unnecessarily. Maybe she even complained about the coffee, as she always did. And, deep down, she believed she had absolute control over everything. She believed that nothing, absolutely nothing, could touch the pedestal she had placed herself on. But there was one detail Melissa never noticed: the stares. The weariness on her colleagues' faces. The whispered conversations when she left the room. The tension that filled the air when she arrived more stressed than usual. Every company feels it when someone drains the energy of the place. But Melissa wasn't sensitive to it. She only saw her own reflection. The rest was just scenery. As I placed my cup in the sink, I imagined the exact moment she received the email from HR, asking her to come to the conference room at 10 a.m. She must have opened the message with that confident smile, thinking she was going to receive praise or discuss some important project. Maybe she even commented to someone, "They must want to reward my performance." Oh, if only she knew. I imagined her walking down the hallway to the meeting, chin held high and confidence inflated, completely oblivious to the possibility that she was about to face her own downfall. And, curiously, I felt a pang of sadness, because her arrogance was so great that it blinded her completely. Blind to her own flaws, blind to the harm she caused, blind to the truth that was arriving. As she walked into that room, I breathed deeply at home, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. Melissa was about to encounter a boundary she had never respected. And that was just the beginning. There was still much to come, and the next step would be an encounter she never imagined facing. When Melissa entered the HR room, I could almost imagine the sound of her heels echoing on the cold floor, as if each click announced her own arrogance. She entered with her posture erect, chin high, her bag hanging from her arm like a trophy. I would have thought they were there to recognize her good work, as I always believed. But seeing the serious faces of the two managers present, I must have glimpsed, even from a distance, the beginning of doubt in their eyes for the first time. She sat down without asking permission, crossing her legs with that theatrical snap she made when she wanted to show control. "So, what's the urgent matter?" she asked with such confidence it was almost pitiful. The managers exchanged a quick glance, that look of someone who knows they're facing an emotional bomb about to explode. The older one slowly opened a folder, as if preparing the ground before the truth. When they started talking, Melissa lost some of her smile. First came the general comments: inappropriate behavior, excessive internal conflicts, defamation of colleagues. She tried to laugh, saying, "Oh, come on, you know how it is. I demand results because I want them." But her voice no longer had the same brightness. It was more tense, faster, more fragile. Control was beginning to slip through her fingers, and she didn't realize it. Then came the reports. Copies.
Dates.
Statements. Melissa picked them up one by one, her hands trembling slightly, trying to maintain her composure. "This is an exaggeration. These people are too sensitive," she retorted, raising her voice. But each sentence she uttered sounded more desperate, more disjointed. It was like watching a mask slowly shatter, revealing not the strong woman she pretended to be, but the raw insecurity she had always tried to hide. When the manager placed the final document on the table, Melissa paled. It was the dismissal notice. A simple, unassuming white envelope, exactly the kind of thing that easily destroys fragile egos. She picked it up as if she couldn't believe her own touch. "This is to be a mistake. You can't do this to me," she said in a tone that mixed anger with the beginnings of panic. The manager took a deep breath before calmly explaining that the decision came from the top. Way from the top. And I can perfectly imagine the moment she heard those words. Executive board. Melissa's eyes widened. For the first time that morning, she didn't know what to say. She tried to argue, tried to point fingers, tried to negotiate. But each attempt seemed worse than the last. The truth was right there, stamped on the paper. She slowly opened the envelope, her hands sweaty, her heart probably pounding in her chest. And when her eyes scanned the page, they stopped exactly where I knew they would. My signature. My name. My position. The silence that filled the room must have been deafening. Melissa stared at it like someone looking at a ghost. This is a joke? My mother-in-law? She couldn't even finish the sentence. At that moment, the ground she thought was so firm finally gave way. Her arrogance evaporated. Her security vanished. All that remained was vulnerability. A vulnerability she had spent her life trying to hide, but which was now there, exposed, in plain sight. And, strangely enough, I felt it. I felt it from here, because it was as if her fall had passed through walls and reached me like a whisper. And while she was still trying to understand what was happening, an important detail had yet to be revealed. Something that would make that moment seem small compared to what was to come. Because up until then, Melissa had only discovered part of the truth, the professional part. But the family truth, the one that would change everything, was still waiting for the right moment to appear. When my signature finally caught Melissa's eye, something shifted in her expression in a way that not even the best actress could replicate. It was as if her face froze mid-movement, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly open, her breath caught in her throat. I could perfectly imagine that silent sound that escapes when the soul is hit so hard that the body doesn't know how to react. She wasn't just surprised. She was devastated inside, trying to piece together the reality she always thought she had mastered. She brought the sheet of paper closer to her face, as if searching for some hidden explanation among the letters. This isn't possible. She must have said it more than once, her voice weak, almost childlike. For the first time, there in that sterile room, Melissa didn't seem like the woman who humiliated her colleagues or who strutted down the hallway as if she wanted to be heard for miles. She seemed small,
Lost. Confused.
and perhaps for the first time human. The manager tried to explain something about hierarchical structure, internal processes, board approval. But Melissa wasn't listening to any of it. She just kept repeating my signature with her eyes, as if each letter burned more than the last. She probably tried to mentally retrace the last few months. All the times she called me outdated, all the venomous phrases, all the little humiliations she threw at me with that crooked little smile. Suddenly, it all made sense to her, but too late. When she finally managed to lift her head, she asked in a trembling voice, Why didn't she say anything? It was almost funny, because Melissa spent so much time talking about power, status, success, and never realized that true power doesn't need to be presented. It exists. Silent. Steady. Constant. While she lived a facade, I lived a purposeful life. While she sought applause, I built a legacy. She never understood that difference, until now. I can imagine the exact moment she realized that every word spoken at the previous dinner had landed directly in my ears like insults hurled at a CEO she didn't even respect. Shame must have coursed through her like an electric shock. Perhaps she felt her hands grow cold, her cheeks burn, her throat tighten. Her mind must have raced, trying to find a justification, an excuse, a way out. But there was no way out. Not this time. She tried to argue, of course. Melissa never accepted defeat. This can't be, it must be a mistake. You don't understand. But each sentence sounded like someone drowning in shallow water. Desperate, useless, pathetic. She even tried to blame other colleagues, invent stories, downplay situations. But none of that helped. The decision had been made. And, worse for her, made by someone she swore was insignificant. The silence that filled the room must have been suffocating. The kind of silence that screams, that weighs heavily, that exposes. Melissa holding the paper with my signature. The managers waiting, impassive. She breathing rapidly, almost choking on her own pride. It was the kind of scene that marks a lifetime. And in her case, it would mark her in a way that would never leave her heart. Because it wasn't just a dismissal. It was the revelation of who she really was and who I had always been. And while she tried to understand what that meant, there was still a question burning inside her. A question she didn't have the courage to ask then. But she would. She would ask it later, when her emotions overflowed and she was completely out of sorts. Why did my husband never tell me? And that question, more than any other, would be the next domino to fall, paving the way for a confrontation that would change our entire family. When Melissa finally realized there was no turning back, that no argument, no emotional manipulation, no fake smile would save her from that situation, the collapse began. First in her eyes. They turned red, glazed, as if she were trapped between the urge to scream and the inability to form words. Then in her hands, which trembled uncontrollably, clutching the paper with my signature as if trying to crush the truth. And then in her voice, which came out as a muffled, fragile moan, completely different from the woman she pretended to be. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't respond. She sat down again, almost falling, gripping the arm of the chair as if that would stop her life from crumbling. "You can't do this to me, you can't," she repeated in a desperate whisper. But it was no longer a plea. It was a lament. A lament of someone who had spent her life believing the world owed her something, and now saw the universe collecting every accumulated debt. When HR calmly explained that she would need to sign the termination papers, Melissa exploded. Her firm demeanor crumbled in seconds, turning into a mixture of tears, accusations, table pounding, and incoherent phrases. "This is unfair. I gave everything to this company. You'll regret this." The irony is that she never gave anything but problems, but an emotional crisis doesn't recognize truth, it only recognizes loss. She began blaming colleagues for the failure, accused innocent people, invented stories, and claimed she was being sabotaged. Her desperation grew with each sentence, as if she were trying to cling to any narrative that would keep her above the shame that was finally overtaking her. It was like watching someone desperately trying to save a house of cards while a whirlwind swept over it. At some point, she realized that no one was reacting. The managers remained calm, firm, almost merciful. And it was precisely this calmness that made Melissa lose what little control she had left. "You don't know who you're messing with," she shouted, but her voice came out trembling, broken. They did know. And they knew even more than she herself imagined. They knew the decision came from me. When she stood up again, her face wet with tears and red marks on her neck, the mask finally fell. The superior, confident, imposing woman was gone. There was only fear, raw fear. The fear she had always tried to hide. The fear of being nobody, of never having been. And that hurt her more than the dismissal itself. After long minutes of chaos, she finally collapsed into a chair, sobbing like a child. That HR room, which she had used so many times to intimidate less experienced colleagues, was now the stage for her ultimate downfall. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was there for the first time that she truly saw herself unfiltered, without pretense, without masks. Vulnerability laid bare. The naked truth. But even in that fragmented state, a small spark still burned within her. The need to blame someone. Someone specific. And she knew exactly who the target of that hatred would be.
Me.
And when she left that room, I knew the next confrontation wouldn't be in the office. It would be inside my own home. I can perfectly imagine how Melissa left the company that day, her hurried pace, her tense shoulders, her face still wet, but now consumed by a fury she could no longer hide. The sound of her heels clicking on the parking lot floor must have echoed like small explosions, each one charged with anger and humiliation. She got into the car without even looking around, throwing her bag onto the passenger seat as if that would ease the weight in her chest. But it didn't. Nothing would. She started the car with trembling hands. The engine roared loudly, and she sped off faster than she should have, as if she wanted to escape the building, the HR department, the truth. But no one escapes themselves. And there, behind the wheel, she was completely alone. No colleagues to impress, no son to manipulate, no audience to applaud her act. It was just her and the shame. While she was driving, her mind must have been in turmoil. The paper with my signature burned in her memory like a hot iron. Every word from the manager echoed in her head. Every accusation against her probably resurfaced like tiny blades. And, of course, the inevitable thought. My mother-in-law was the CEO? My mother-in-law fired me. I can imagine the stifled scream that must have risen in her throat as she repeated those phrases mentally. Anger began to take over, that irrational anger that arises when wounded pride tries to rebuild itself. She slammed her hand on the steering wheel, cursed the traffic, argued with cars that weren't even in her way. Fury blinded her. The adrenaline pulsed so strongly that, for a few seconds, she must have felt capable of anything. And that's where the danger lies. When an emotionally unstable person loses their footing, they also lose their limits. Perhaps she tried to mentally blame my son. Why didn't he ever tell me? She must have repeated 1,000 times. Or maybe she blamed me, as she always did with everything she couldn't control. In her mind, there was no room for self-evaluation. If something went wrong, it was always someone else's fault. And this time, I was the preferred target. A perfect target for the victim narrative she was already beginning to construct. She drove so fast, she must have run red lights without realizing it. Every turn seemed like a desperate attempt to escape her own emotional collapse. But the destination was obvious. Inevitable. She wasn't going home to process the situation. She was going home determined to find an explanation, or rather, a justification, that would bolster her wounded pride. She wanted confrontation. She wanted answers. She wanted someone to blame, and that someone was me. When she finally parked in front of her house, the air inside the car must have been heavy, hot, suffocating. She stood there for a few seconds, breathing rapidly, looking at the steering wheel as if trying to stop her own body from trembling. But she couldn't, because no mask can withstand such a great fall. Her humiliation hadn't just been professional, it had been personal, directly connected to me. And at that moment, she made the decision I both feared and hoped for. She would go after my son. And then after me. And I knew that when she knocked on my door, she wouldn't come in peace. She would come as someone who had lost everything, and when a person like that arrives, she arrives ready to destroy whatever she finds in her path. I was sitting in the living room, trying to organize my thoughts after everything that had happened, when I heard the front door slam shut. My son rushed in, his face red, his breathing heavy, as if he had run the whole way. He didn't greet me. He didn't smile. He didn't take off his shoes. He just stood there in front of me, with a look that mixed anger, confusion, and a fear that I recognized immediately, the fear that his world was about to crumble. He gripped the phone so tightly his fingers turned white. "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" His voice wasn't a plea for explanation. It was trapped pain, an open wound. I felt my hands tremble. He looked at me as if I had taken some fundamental truth from him, as if I had hidden a part of my soul. But how could I explain something so big? How could I tell him that the silence wasn't a secret, it was protection? I asked him to sit down, but he refused with a brusque gesture. "You're the CEO? The owner? The founder? And you never told me?" He was hurt, not by the truth itself, but by the fact that he had lived with me his whole life without realizing who I really was. And that deeply wounded his pride. I took a deep breath, seeking strength not in my voice but in my heart. My son, I never hid it. I just didn't announce it. There's a difference. He ran his hands through his hair, nervous. He paced back and forth across the room, unable to look me in the eye for more than 2 seconds. "Melissa was fired. She's desperate. She said you did it on purpose. That you wanted to humiliate her." That's when my heart tightened, not because of what Melissa was saying, but because my son was torn between two realities, the one he had always known and the one he had just discovered. I tried to explain calmly. I told him that my position in the company had always been something I kept separate from my personal life because I didn't want to interfere in relationships. I explained that I never used my position to dominate anyone. I explained that I built that entire empire not to be venerated, but to ensure my son had a secure future. I spoke with all the love a mother can carry in her heart, but he was still far from listening to me with an open heart. "Why did she never know?" he insisted, his voice lower, almost sad. "Why did you never tell the woman I love?" The answer was simple, but painful. Because she never asked. The silence that followed was a heavy silence, which seemed to fill the entire room. He blinked slowly, and I realized that the sentence had affected him more than anything else I could have said. Melissa never asked my story. Never cared. And that said it all. He finally sat down on the sofa, exhausted, as if the weight of that entire revelation had drained his strength. I approached slowly, placed my hand on his, and felt the tension ease slightly. "My son, I didn't do this to hurt you. I did it because it was necessary. Not because I was your wife, but because I was a professional who harmed other people." He took a deep breath. For the first time, he listened to me. But even with my arguments, I knew something still burned inside him. It wasn't just about Melissa's job. It was about his entire life, which suddenly seemed to have been built on an incomplete image of his own mother. And I knew that the next meeting, not between him and Melissa, but between me and her, would test all the bonds of this family. After my son finally calmed down, I knew there was no longer room for me to hide behind silence. He deserved to know the woman I was, the woman I still am, and everything I built before Melissa entered our lives with her arrogance disguised as charm. So I took a deep breath, sat beside him, and, for the first time in years, told him my whole story, not in fragments, but as a continuous thread of struggle, sacrifice, and purpose. I talked about my first job, when I earned so little that I even had to economize on soap. I recounted how I used to study in the early hours of the morning, my face pressed against the books, fighting off sleep. I told of when I started the business in the cramped room of an old building, with half a dozen ideas and a courage I don't even know where I got it from. While I was talking, my son looked at me as if he were seeing a stranger, a strong, tireless stranger he had never truly met. He breathed slowly, absorbing every detail, and his expression changed. It began with surprise, then admiration, and finally a certain remorse. Perhaps for having assumed for so long that I was just a simple woman living on memories. I saw his eyes light up at times, especially when I told him about the nights I would put him to bed and then go back to work until sunrise to secure the future he is today. I also spoke of the prejudices I faced, of how many times men underestimated me, thinking I had no voice, of how many meetings I ended in hidden tears, only to return stronger, of each victory that no one saw, but which built each step of my company's success. And, in that silent room, with my son sitting before me, I felt as if I were releasing years of history trapped inside me. When I finished, he was silent for a few seconds. He just looked at me, and I could clearly see the exact moment he understood. He understood that Melissa never knew how to ask because she never wanted to see beyond the surface. He understood that I didn't tell him not out of shame, but out of humility. And he understood that the problem was never my silence, but her arrogance. He held my hand, this time without hesitation. "Mom, you did all this alone?" I smiled, a simple smile, but full of all the strength life has given me. "Yes, my son, and I did it for you." His voice broke, and I realized that this revelation wasn't destroying anything. It was rebuilding our bond in a new way, more mature, more genuine. But there was another part of the story I needed to tell. Melissa's complaints over the years, the attempts at manipulation in the office, the way she treated subordinates. I showed him documents, emails, records. Not to hurt him, but to show that my decision hadn't been impulsive or emotional. It was professional.
Fair.
Necessary. He read everything in silence, and each page seemed to peel away a piece of the defense he was still trying to maintain for her. When he finished, she took a deep breath and leaned back on the sofa. The truth had completely overtaken him. But I knew that the next impact, the final impact, wouldn't happen there, in that room. The truth still needed to reach someone who had always run from it, Melissa. And when it did, the whole house would tremble. The afternoon had barely begun when I heard the doorbell ring aggressively, almost violently, as if the person on the other end was holding back fury with their fingertips. My son got up first, but I put my hand on his arm, signaling for him to leave it to me. I already knew who it was. I could feel the energy even before opening the door. And when the latch gave way, there she was, Melissa. Red eyes, disheveled hair, a face swollen from crying. A woman completely different from the one who humiliated me at dinner. She entered without asking permission, pushing the door open as if she still had some control over the place. There was something wild about her, something that is born when pride is broken for the first time. "You," she screamed, pointing her finger at me as if she wanted to pierce my soul. "You ruined my life. You destroyed everything." Her voice was so full of despair that it echoed through the house, making everything inside me tremble, not from fear, but from pity. Pity for someone who never learned to deal with her own monsters. She started pacing back and forth, banging her hands against the walls, knocking things over, as if the anger needed to get out of her body somehow. "You hid this from me. You deceived me. You humiliated me in front of the whole company." With each accusation, I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, because I knew that reacting emotionally would only fuel her fury. Melissa was in freefall physically, emotionally, and mentally. My son tried to intervene, but she pushed him so hard he almost lost his balance. "Don't talk to me," she yelled. "You lied too. You knew. You knew, and you didn't tell me." My son looked at me, confused, because that accusation wasn't just unfair, it was absurd. He hadn't known anything until the day before. But Melissa, in the throes of rage, needed to find someone to blame. And the closer they were, the better. I approached her slowly, carefully, like someone approaching a wounded animal. Melissa, you need to breathe. You need to sit down.
But she laughed.
A hysterical, loud, desperate laugh. Breathe? Breathe? How do you expect me to breathe after what you did to me? Her hands trembled so much that she had to press them against her chest. For the first time, I could see what lay behind the arrogance. Fear. Pure fear. Fear of never having been good enough. She turned to me, and her eyes, even though red, held an intensity one had never seen before. You hated me from day one, didn't you? That's why you did this. That's why you destroyed my career. And there I felt my heart ache. Because it wasn't hate. It never was. It was a boundary. And she confused boundaries with attack because she never knew how to differentiate real love from emotional submission. When I tried to explain, she lost what little control she had left. She lunged toward the table, knocked over a picture frame with our family photo, and screamed so loudly that for a moment I feared the neighbors would call the police. It was a scream full of pain, but not the pain of injustice. The pain of the shattering of an ego she had maintained for years. The pain of realizing that that mask no longer worked. And then the inevitable happened. Melissa fell to her knees on the floor, her hands covering her face, sobbing like a child who finally recognizes that she has nowhere else to run. It was the final collapse, the wound open, exposed, bleeding. And in that moment, as she wept before us, I knew that the outcome of that story would not be decided by my position, nor by my company, nor by her downfall. It would be decided by the next step, the most difficult of all. After Melissa's meltdown subsided and she left my house, not because she was kicked out, but because she was finally too exhausted to keep yelling, the whole house was plunged into an eerie silence. A silence like the end of a storm, one that mixes relief with melancholy. I sat down slowly on the sofa, feeling my legs finally heavy. I looked at my son, who was leaning against the wall, pale, trembling slightly, as if he had just survived an emotional hurricane. He approached me slowly, almost without strength. When he finally sat beside me, I felt that something there had changed forever. Not between us, but within him. His eyes, once filled with blind admiration for the woman he had chosen, were now filled with doubt and a kind of clarity that only arises when life forcefully shatters our illusions. He didn't need to say anything. His silence already said it all. He was seeing Melissa, for the first time, without a filter. Later that day, he confessed to me that Melissa had left home without saying when she would return. And, for the first time, he didn't chase after her. He simply allowed the space between them to be the air they both needed to breathe. He said he needed to think, that he needed to understand what he was actually experiencing, and that for the first time in a long time he wanted silence. Real silence. Not the kind he swallowed to avoid arguments, but the silence that helps one see clearly. I felt a deep sadness for him, because nobody enters a marriage expecting to find that kind of pain. But I also felt a pang of pride, because, despite everything, my son was finally waking up. He was seeing that love isn't control, it isn't fear, it isn't emotional manipulation. Love is freedom.
It's respect.
And he hadn't received any of that from Melissa, not because he didn't deserve it, but because she didn't know how to give it. In the following days, he immersed himself in silent introspection. He spent hours walking around the house, looking at old photos, reflecting. And I, even with a heavy heart, let him. Because each person has their own time to understand what love is and what love shouldn't be. Sometimes, life demands that we see the truth with our own eyes. And at that moment, my son was finally seeing it. Melissa, for her part, didn't respond immediately. She sent short, confusing messages, trying to play the victim and then justify herself, oscillating between "you don't understand me" and "your mother destroyed our lives." But my son no longer reacted the same way. Something inside him had shifted. He began to reject the victim narrative she had always used to control everything around her. There, in that silence, he was freeing himself, even if he didn't fully realize it yet. And I went back to doing something I hadn't done in a long time, taking care of myself. I went back to walking early, drinking my coffee calmly, opening the windows and letting the sun in without fear of bothering anyone. I felt, little by little, my spirit expand after months of being shrunk by the tensions of living together. It was like rediscovering a version of myself that I had kept hidden away in the back of a drawer, strong, serene, whole. When my son finally decided to really talk to me, he said something I'll never forget. "Mom, thank you for showing me what I didn't want to see." His voice was firm, mature, as if years of emotional blindness had finally broken. And in that instant, I knew a new phase was beginning for both of us. Not perfect, not easy, but real. And even though the story with Melissa didn't yet have a definitive end at that moment, something inside me told me that we were moving towards a new beginning built not on illusions, but on respect, awareness, and truth. And every story that is reborn like that always finds its own way. When it was all finally over, when the dust settled, when the shouting turned to silence, and each truth found its place, I realized something that life takes time to teach. Nobody is exactly who they seem to be. Not your daughter-in-law, not your son, not you. And sometimes, an emotional earthquake is needed for each person to reveal their true essence, good or bad. My son saw who Melissa really was, and Melissa saw who I've always been. And have you seen who is truly by your side? How many people smile at you at the dinner table, but do they keep venom behind their teeth? How many relationships seem like love, but is it just fear and manipulation in disguise? Would you be able to recognize it? Because in the end, life demands payment for what we have built. Demand character, demand respect, demand truth, and sooner or later, every mask falls off, especially those who try to hide their arrogance. This story isn't just about me, or just about Melissa. It's about you. Regarding the choices you make, it's about who you let into your family, who do you allow to decide your destiny. And if this story made you think, if it touched you in some way, or it reminded you of someone, to leave a comment below. I want to know your opinion. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and enable notifications, because I still have many stories that's what you need to hear.